Welcome to Biology 160, Introduction to Anatomy and Physiology. This set of lectures is going to be on the digestive system. There's a lot to talk about in the digestive system, but overall there's four main functions that the digestion system has, and you're probably already familiar with this. First of all, the digestive system takes in food from the outside environment, and we call this ingestion. The next thing that happens is the actual digesting of the food. And so once we take that food in, we have to break that food down into smaller pieces, because eventually we're going to want to absorb that food into our body so that we can use it. And so the smaller the pieces, then the easier it is to absorb. And in actuality, we take that food and we break it down into its component parts, which you've probably heard about before, or we've talked a little bit about in this class: carbohydrates, amino acids, fats, oils, and things like that. Organic molecules. It breaks them down into these smaller molecules so that they can then be absorbed. Digestion has two main parts. First, we physically break up the food, and we sometimes call this mechanical digestion, and that's what we'll talk about in this course. And then we also break it down chemically as well. So first we break it down into little pieces, just like taking a hammer and smashing up a cracker, and then we take enzymes and we break the molecules apart that build that cracker, and then we're able to absorb it into our bloodstream and take it and get it to all the places it needs to get into our body. Finally, there's the leftovers, the waste, the things that we can't use, and those are excreted from the body through defecation. So there's different parts of the two main parts of the digestive system. There's first what we call the alimentary canal, and this is basically a open passageway that goes from your mouth, starting in your mouth, and it goes clear through down till you get to the anus. This is one straight tube, one long tube, one continuous tube, all the way through. And this is sometimes called the gastrointestinal or the GI tract as well. Something to remember as we're talking about the digestive system: when we're in the alimentary canal, we are still outside the body. Even though it's inside, it's still outside because it has contact with the outside environment from both ends here. And so think about this kind of like maybe like a donut is sometimes how I hear this explained. So if you have a donut and you stick your finger in the hole of the donut, you're still outside the donut. You're not inside the donut. And if you extend that donut and make it a long tube, if you go inside that tube, you're still outside. You're not actually inside the donut. Same thing with our alimentary canal here. So this is a continuous tube it comes in contact with the outside environment, and so it's covered with a mucus layer in order to catch all the things that aren't supposed to be there. So all of our the outsides of our insides are always covered by a mucous membrane. Then we have the accessory digestive organs, and these are the support organs that are not part of the actual tube, but they're support organs that allow us to digest food and do what we need to do. The parts of the alimentary canal are as follows. We have the mouth. This is where we're first going to enter the canal, and then we're going to go down through the pharynx into the stomach, and then from the stomach we're going to get into the small intestine, and then finally into the large intestine with all of its parts. And then at the end here, then we're going to exit through the anus. And those are the parts of the canal. Then we have accessory organs as well, though. Oh, and I forgot the esophagus. And the esophagus, so you go from the mouth, the pharynx to the esophagus, then to the stomach, then to the small intestine. Then we have the accessory organs that are going to help out here. We have the teeth, which aren't shown here. We have the tongue. We have the pancreas, and the liver, and the gallbladder. And the appendix doesn't really function in digestion, but we'll talk a little bit about the appendix probably at some point during this lecture. And then there's the spleen. You can see where the spleen is located as well. Also not necessarily part of the digestive system, but it is in this same area here. So those are the parts here that we're going to talk about. The salivary glands as well function in helping to digest food as we go through this. So the layers of the alimentary canal, this continuous tube has some different layers. And the 4 layers are first the mucosa layer, then there's the submucosa, the muscularis externa, and the serosa. So let's take a look at each of these here and what they do. First of all, we have the mucus layer. And this is the very innermost layer of the digestive system. It has cells that produce the mucus, and it's a very moist membrane. The layer of cells are epithelial cells. Depending on where you are in the alimentary canal, there may be different types of epithelial cells. In your mouth, you have stratified squamous cells, and also in your esophagus. Once you get down into the rest of the digestive system, alimentary canal, then you're mostly going to have simple columnar epithelial cells. There's also a small amount of connective tissue as well in this layer, and then there's a smooth muscle layer. Now here's a picture of the different layers. So right now we're looking at the mucosa layer, and you can see it's this very innermost layer here, inside the tube here. And we have the surface epithelium, which is on the very inside, producing mucus that's going to line this whole tube. And then we have the lamina propria, which is a connective tissue, thin connective tissue layer, and then a thin layer of smooth muscle as well. All the muscle in this alimentary canal is going to be smooth muscle, so we don't control it. It just moves the food along as it needs to. The next layer is the submucosa. This is just beneath the mucus making layer, the mucosa. And it's made up of soft connective tissue. And in this connective tissue, this is where we find the blood vessels, the nerve endings, the lymphatics, and all those sorts of things. The mucosa layer does not have its own blood circulation, just like the other epithelial tissues in the body. And so it has to get its blood and its nourishment from the submucosa layer, as we can see here. So here's our submucosa layer. So here's the submucosa here. So it's this layer here on the outside. You can see it's connective tissue. You can see the blood vessels running through over here, and the nerve endings as well. So we have our arteries and our veins, our arterioles, and our venules coming through here and nourishing the rest of the canal. And then finally we have the muscularis externa, which is a smooth muscle layer. And this smooth muscle layer is what contracts and moves the food along the digestive tract, but also it helps to churn that food and mechanically break down that food as well. There's 2 layers in the alimentary canal. We have a circular layer of muscles, then we also have a longitudinal layer of muscles. We'll see later in the stomach there's another layer as well, but in most of the canal we just have these 2 layers of muscle. So here's the inner layer, the circular layer, and the circular layer runs in circles around the canal, and then so when it contracts, it makes the opening here smaller. So as it contracts, this gets smaller. And then we also have longitudinal muscles, and they run lengthwise along this track, so they come like this. And when they contract, they make the canal shorter. And so between these 2 functions, both squeezing and shortening, that can push food along the canal. This is almost the same way that an earthworm moves. So if you look at an earthworm, if you've ever seen an earthworm move around, it has a circular layer of muscles and also longitudinal layers of muscles. And the contraction of these 2 types of muscles is what allows it to move around. We also have the serosa, and this produces the peritoneum. So just like the other organs we've talked about in this class, the digestive system also has a visceral and a parietal serosa layer, and we call these the visceral peritoneum and the parietal peritoneum. And it's a continuous layer but the visceral layer is the one that is closest to the organs, and then the parietal layer lines the abdominal pelvic cavity. And so let's take a look at this just for a minute, and it produces a fluid that's going to be in that cavity between the two layers, and this allows the organs of the digestive system to move around without scraping against each other and bumping into each other, and allows them to not have any friction, so they're able to do their job, because our digestive system organs do move around a lot. So in this diagram here, you can see the parietal peritoneum, and it's this outer layer. And then over here, you see the visceral peritoneum, which is the inner layer, which is lining the organs. You'll notice here also there's this thing called the mesenteries, and these are tissues that attach the organs of the digestive system to the back, or the spine, back here by the spinal column here. So notice how the mesenteries come and they wrap around these organs, and then they're attached to the back here, and they drape over in this case, and they wrap around. So the mesenteries are holding all these organs to the back, and it's this fibrous, almost like a membrane that's there. You can see also the peritoneal cavity in between that fluid-filled space, and you can see all the organs here, how they're surrounded by the peritoneum, and then the mesenteries are holding them in place. Depending on which organ you're looking at, the peritoneum may not totally surround it, just because the mesenteries are coming in there to attach on and hold those organs in place. Let's continue now by looking at each of the organs of the alimentary canal, starting with the mouth. So the mouth, the job of the mouth is to break up the food. So it's where mechanical digestion begins, and also chemical digestion as well. The act of chewing is called mastication. So you masticate food. The walls of the mouth are made up of the bones we've already talked about in this class. We have the hard palate, which is the palatine bone, and then we have the soft palate, which is not bone, but it's just made up of tissue. Hanging down here, we have the uvula, which is that little hangy thing in the back of your throat. When you look back in someone's throat, you can see it hanging there. You have the teeth in the front. We have the lips, which are called the labia, and they protect the anterior opening, so we're able to close them over our mouth. The cheeks, which are soft tissue, form the lateral walls, and between the labia and the teeth, we have this little area called the vestibule. Inside the mouth, we have the oral cavity, and behind that, and then we have the tongue in that area as well. The tongue is a strong muscle, and it's attached to to a number of places. It's attached to the hyoid bone down here, and also the styloid process, which isn't on this slide here, but of the skull. And then also it has this called the lingual frenulum, which attaches it to the front of the mouth, to the floor of the mouth, and this is what holds it there. In some children, this may be too short that it doesn't allow the tongue to really move around, and they have to do a little surgery to free that up. Notice in the back of the mouth, we also have our tonsils. We have our palatine tonsil and our lingual tonsil that function in the immune system of our body, trying to catch things that are coming through. Our mouth is a place where a lot of bacteria enters into our body, and so these tonsils are stationed here to try to catch them as they're moving down. Notice here we have the epiglottis, which will close over the trachea when we swallow. Then we move down into the esophagus. This area in here is the pharynx. In the last lecture, when we talked about the respiratory system, we talked about the three parts of the pharynx, which are the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. The nasopharynx is not part of the digestive system. Unless you eat through your nose, it's not going to be part of that. And we don't actually want food going up into the nasopharynx. The oropharynx is the place where the respiratory system and the digestive system converge. And then we have the laryngopharynx down below, where the respiratory tract and the digestive tract then split off again and go their separate ways. Down below the mouth here, the mouth and the pharynx, we then get into the esophagus. The pharynx moves the food through the pharynx to the esophagus, and there's some muscle layers there that move it. We have a longitudinal inner layer and a circular outer layer of the pharynx that moves the food down into the esophagus. And the food is moved by alternating contractions of the muscle layers called peristalsis. And we'll see this in a number of places as we go through the stomach, the small intestine, the large intestine. And we'll talk a little bit more about what peristalsis is later, but remember that word. So the esophagus is a tube that is basically just a passageway from the mouth to the stomach. There's no digestion that takes place, mechanical or chemical, in the esophagus. It's simply a passageway to get from one place to the next. It's about 10 inches long. It goes from the pharynx to the stomach, past the diaphragm. And it moves the food by peristalsis as well. And this is the first place where we see all the layers of the alimentary canal that we talked about before. This is where we see the mucosa, the submucosa, the muscular layer, and then the serosa layer. Here in the esophagus, it has all of them. And then once we get through the esophagus, then we're going to move into the stomach. Here we are now into the stomach. The stomach is an organ of digestion that's found on the left side of the body, and you see its familiar shape here. We're going to look at some of the parts of the stomach. As the food is coming down out of the esophagus, it's first going to go through the cardioesophageal sphincter. Now, this isn't a true sphincter in the sense of other sphincters where you have muscles that are going to close this off, but it does keep the food in to some extent. But as you know, when someone is sick and vomiting, that the cardioesophageal sphincter does not really keep the food in the stomach, so food can move back up, but it does try to keep the food in the stomach. We have the fundus, which is this area of the stomach that kind of curves upward, and then we move down into the body of the stomach, which is this middle section here, and then finally down here to the pylorus. The pylorus is where the food is going to leave the stomach and is going to enter the small intestine through the pyloric sphincter. And this is a true sphincter that can completely close off and keep the food in here, and then it can open and allow a little food to move into the duodenum, which is part of the small intestine. The outer part of the stomach is called the greater curvature. The inside is called the lesser curvature. And you can see the layers of the muscles. We have a longitudinal layer here. We have a circular layer, and they function similarly to the longitudinal circular layers we've seen in other parts of this lecture of the digestive system. But then there's a third layer called the oblique layer, and this is a layer that runs at an angle across, and this layer allows the stomach to work a little bit different than the other parts of the digestive alimentary canal. It allows the stomach to really churn the food back and forth and move it and really start that mechanical digestion and break things up. There's also some chemical digestion that also starts in the stomach as well. Notice here the rugae, which are the folds in the stomach. So if you cut open the stomach, you'll see all these little folds, and this allows the stomach to expand. When the stomach is completely distended, it can hold almost up to a gallon of food. And so not only does the stomach function in digestion of materials, but it also functions as a storage area. So as the food's coming down here, it can stay in the stomach, and then it can be let out into the small intestine in small parts, a little at a time, so that the digestion happens at a good speed, so we're able to do all that digestion absorption. We're not overwhelming the small intestine, and so that's the stomach has that function as well. All along the stomach, we have these little pits that are surrounded by cells, and these function in secreting the gastric juice, we call it, that you find in the stomach. And different cells in these little pits have different functions. We have mucosa neck cells that are producing mucus. We have parietal cells as well. Parietal cells are the ones that produce hydrochloric acid, a very acidic substance that is in our stomach that helps to start to break down food. We have gastric glands that are producing gastric juice, and then we have chief cells. The chief cells are also part of digestion. They produce pepsinogens, and pepsinogens are protein enzymes that can break down proteins. Pepsinogens are interesting because they're only activated in the presence of a very acidic conditions, and so the HCl in our stomach is what helps to activate the pepsinogen and allows it to do its chemical digestive job. These cells, some of these cells also produce something called intrinsic factor, which is important in absorbing vitamin B12 in the small intestine. Here's a closer picture here of the parietal cells and the chief cells, and you can see the chief cells are producing this pepsinogen, and as the parietal cells are producing the HCl, that HCl activates pepsinogen and it becomes what we call pepsin. And the pepsin is an enzyme which actually breaks down proteins into the smaller parts called amino acids. After all this digestion inside the stomach happens, the food is called chyme. C-H-Y-M-E. And chyme is what is then going to go into the small intestine.